From the University of Nebraska at Omaha, this is Inside Insights. I'm your host, Blake Ursch, in for Aaron Grace. Join us as we discuss today's most pressing issues in terrorism and targeted violence with experts from the field. We're here today with someone who needs no introduction. This is Seamus Hughes. He is a senior research faculty and policy associate here at NCITE. He's a national expert on navigating federal court records. And in addition to that, in addition to many things, he leads a research project with Pete Seamy at Chapman University that examines the trend of threats to public officials. So welcome to the podcast, Seamus.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's always good to see you.
Always good to see you. So let's just get right into it. So can you just start off by sort of characterizing this trend for us, the scope of the project and sort of what you've seen over the past, I think it's over a decade now or decade of examining these threats to public officials?
Yeah, so my colleague Pete Seamy at Chapman University and a team of students at Chapman and at University of Nebraska, Omaha. So what we did is we wanted to figure out, what does it look like in terms of federal prosecutions for threats against public officials? And so we went back to cases all the way back to 2013 and went through every Department of Justice press release, every news report, every filing we could find in the last 12 plus years to get a sense of it. And so that involved going through tens of thousands of legal documents and building out a case of saying, listen, did the Department of Justice bring X number of cases in this year and why in the other year, and why is the change, and what does the kind of the threat landscape look like on that? And so what we found is, there has been obviously a history of threats against public officials. This is not new. What is new is the rise of the numbers, meaning that in 2016, we saw a dramatic rise of federal arrests. And so when I say dramatic, I mean we used to have 20, 30, and this year we're on pace for 98 as of now, and it's November, so we've got a few more months left, and so that is a record number of arrests in 1 year for it. And we can dive into the reasons why of that, but it's a combination of basically a normalization of violence, a sense that you can send a tweet or make a phone call and threaten your local official. And it's also, I think we can't discount the focus by federal prosecutors on this in a way they hadn't in the last 2 or 3 years. We've seen a stand up of the Election Threats Task Force at Department of Justice. They brought more than a dozen cases in the last year. And so there is a focus, not only from the state and local level saying, listen, we're seeing these threats, we don't know what to do with them. And the federal officials saying, okay, let's put our finger on the scale on this one.
Who are the targets of these threats? I know we're talking about public officials, but I know that that's a broad category. So can you sort of tell us who were sort of facing these threats?
Yeah, so we categorize them into 4 different categories, right? One is education officials, and we saw that play out during the discussions on which books can go on libraries. We saw threats rise up during that. We also did a category of health officials. So during COVID, that spiked dramatically for that. And then elected and election officials. So folks that were the people that you would vote for or the people that are running the votes on that. And then finally, law enforcement. And so that would be, everyone in between, judges, things like that. And so if you take away the numbers, I mean, the numbers are kind of interesting because there is a not insignificant number of individuals where we can actually discern an ideological focus, meaning that there are a number of individuals who Meet the Press on a Sunday, see whoever's talking and make a threat that day. And it's not necessarily ideological in focus. It's really just what's in the news that day. But of the ones that have ideological focus, the vast majority are racially motivated violent extremists. So neo-Nazis, skinheads, a lot of anti-Semitism playing out. So a lot of misogyny playing out in these type of things. But it's not just limited to one ideology, right? So if you look at last week on Election Day, there was an arrest of someone who allegedly threatened to shoot up the Trump rally in Michigan. And then another arrest of an individual who threatened to kill a poll worker who was a supporter of the president-elect. So it's a long spectrum of folks that are in there. What we're seeing is what's probably the most concerning of it is just the volume of it all, right? So put it in context, the U.S. Capitol Police every year puts out their review of threats against their officials. So that's congressmen and senators, right? That number is in the thousands, and 4,000 or 5,000 every year, and it keeps going up. Last year kind of evened out a little bit, but not a whole lot. And so these numbers are going up in every category.
This was obviously a very tense and difficult election season. I mean, we had 2 assassination attempts on the person who is now the president-elect. I'm wondering, like, what did we see in terms of this trend in the ramp up to the election? So, you mentioned like healthcare workers as a target during the pandemic. What happened, like, threats wise leading up to the election and even on election day?
Yeah, so if you look at the last couple months, I think 1/4 of all, or if not 1/3 of all, cases involve threats to election or elected officials. When anyone gave a press conference on how they're going to count ballots, they usually got a threat immediately following. And so whatever that, again, what is ever in the news, right? What is in the zeitgeist of the conversation right now becomes the be all end all. And so we may see this kind of ebb and flow. Like we said, during COVID, health officials were the main threat. During, you had election officials, and now we're kind of in this area of at least elected officials for the time being. And I worry less about it is very concerning when there is numerous assassination attempts against the president-elect. But there, in theory, should be an apparatus to protect that individual, right? Secret Service, threat assessments, those type of things. I have more concerns when it involves a kind of frontline worker, right? So if you're an election official in Iowa and you get, and this happened, you get a letter with powder and a threatening note, you don't really know who to call, right? Do you call your local police officer? Do you call the FBI? And if so, who in the FBI? What phone number do you use? If you get doxxed online, like, are you moving your family out that day? Or are you going to a hotel down the street? And we don't have kind of a playbook of what we do with these situations. And so the higher up folks, the congressmen, senators, presidents, there is a well-worn system that we kind of check the box and go through. It is less kind of systematic when it comes to frontline officials. And that has a stunting effect on democracy, right? If you're less likely to raise your hand to run for elected office if you're going to be subject to threats. In fact, we saw that in a gentleman in Virginia who decided not to run for city council after he got a number of death threats from a neo-Nazi. And so that has what Pete Seamy and I call a slow burn on democracy, right? Less and less people are willing to raise their hands. And the people that are willing to raise their hands and say, yeah, I want to do that, that's a little concerning for me as a voter, if you kind of want to knowingly go into that. And so this is going to cause an issue in terms of not only the front end of the assassination attempts, but also in kind of the back end of lower level or frontline officials.
I'm interested in kind of the cumulative effects of like the volume of threats increasing. So I'm curious to know, do you see sentiment changing, like are the threats causing a change in sentiment, or is a change in sentiment causing the threats with regard to like supporting political violence or supporting political violence?
Yeah, I mean, it again tends to be the news cycle, right? So whatever's in the news cycle that day is going to be what ends up being a threat. There's going to be, listen, this is the internet, right? So there's going to be a subset of people that are just angry all the time. That's just the nature of the internet, and God love us, right? But there's also going to be a smaller subset of people that say, okay, it's not enough just to express my displeasure in whatever policy thing is, but I have to take it a step further with violence. And that's really where the concern is, right? We should talk a little bit about kind of the First Amendment line between threats and protected speech. There is a history of legal doctrine that says, listen, you can, in theory, say, I hate Seamus Hughes and I hope he dies. That is not that's not something you can prosecute. But if you said, I hate Seamus Hughes and I'm going to kill him on Friday with a knife at his house and this is his address, that is a directed threat. right? And so that crosses a line, and it usually hits against a legal statute called interstate commerce threats. It's an old school statute from like the 1900s, which was, if you sent a threatening letter on the Pony Express and it crossed a state line, that would be interstate commerce threats, and ergo you could be charged with that. Well, fast forward now, you have the internet, you have phones, you have social media, all those inherently cross state lines. And so it allows you for a level of elasticity in the federal district that you normally wouldn't have, say, 100 years ago. And so it does provide law enforcement and prosecutors a little bit more wiggle room than they had in the past. What's also interesting in this is we haven't really played out the legal questions on this, meaning that the vast majority of individuals who are charged with threatening a public official tend to plead out before a trial, right? They tend to take a plea agreement and they move on. But if we did play out that question of First Amendment versus and protected speech versus illegal activities, that might be an interesting question, but we haven't reached that point in the legal process in a lot of these cases.
So that brings up an interesting point so our data set that we're talking about here, it's federal cases, right? So I guess in this, are we seeing this at the state level? And I guess how can you characterize like the overall problem based on just this snapshot that we're seeing? So I guess we're looking at this kind of narrow piece of it. How would you say, like, just even anecdotally, if like, what does the overall threat picture look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, right? So federal arrests are just the tip of the spear, right? They are just if it gets to a federal arrest, it's risen to a level of which there's a serious concern. Most of these cases usually get kicked to a state level or a district attorney or a local prosecutor. And so in terms of, what does it look like in the numbers? I think you look at Arizona, 1/4 of election officials decided they weren't going to be election officials the next election because they got threats. If you do polling, the Brennan Center has done polling on election officials. I think 1/4 have said we get constant threats and we don't know what to do about this. And so I think there was the determination at the federal level, and a lot of this was bubbling up. Like there was state officials in Arizona and Michigan and Idaho that said, listen, we're getting threats and Department of Justice isn't protecting us. And so the Department of Justice stood up that election threats task force as almost like an answer to a lot of these complaints that were bubbling up to them on this. And so we'll see. And the question becomes, does this continue on in the future? As we reorganize Department of Justice as is traditional during the transition to a new administration, does the election threats task force get stood down? Do cases get kicked to the state level, or do they continue on in the way they have been, which is a pretty regular clip of a couple cases a week?
I'm interested in your thoughts on this overall trend now that we are past the election. The decision in the election was decisive. Do you think this takes down the temperature at all, or do you think the nature of the people making these threats changes in the wake of the election results?
We may see targeting differ, right? So the threat to the Trump rallies is a pretty good example of that, kind of a shift than we've seen historically when it comes to the targets of threats on that. What's going to be interesting in all of this is kind of twofold. One is there's going to be a delay in the process, meaning that if you made a threat on election day, it probably takes a week or two for the FBI and Department of Justice to knock on your door, ask you if you're serious, and tell you to knock it off or bring charges against it. So there may be a latency delay in all of this. The other thing I think we have to consider is, Pete Seamy and I are still going through the data with a bunch of our students, and what we're finding is there's a pretty good number of what we call serial threateners. So these are individuals that will threaten a federal judge 4 years ago, spend 3 years in jail, come out and threaten a new person once they're out. And so there's kind of rhyme or reason to it, but they continue on it. And it shows me that our current approach is a bit all over the map, meaning that if I get prosecuted in Oregon for threatening a public official, I likely got probation and a diversion program, and then they drop the charges. If I got charged or sentenced in Massachusetts, I may be facing 5 years. It's entirely down to kind of prosecutorial discretion. The U.S. Attorney's Office can determine what they want to do. They can make a recommendation to the judge on what they want to do, and so there is no kind of systematic or normalization of how we prosecute these cases.
I'm interested in just sort of your own background. I'm going to pull the fact that we work together as prerogative here, that I'm reading something into it. But I know you have experience in academia, you have experience in government. So how has your professional experience informed your interest in this project?
So I found this project interesting for a couple of reasons. One is there wasn't any other data out there. A lot of polling, a lot of surveys of folks, but no real hard numbers when it came to prosecutions. And what I was interested in is how many they prosecute could be an indication of threat, but it also could be an indication of interest and priority by the Department of Justice, right? Are they throwing exact or proper resources towards this? And so that was one of the drivers for me. The other driver for me, and let's just be perfectly honest, is I like a puzzle, right? And so, if I could only rely on Department of Justice's press releases, I bet our numbers would be half. And so, what we did is, Pete, myself, Camden Carmichael, a student at NCITE, and others at Chapman University, we rolled up our sleeves and said, okay, well, we have this case, and let's look for every other case that's similar to that maybe didn't reach a level to a Department of Justice press release. And so that meant going through every assisting U.S. attorney filing that covers those cases, going through local news reporting that didn't rise to a level of national news, those type of things, to get a sense of what else is out there so we can tell a story, right? And the story can be, listen, there's only been 98 federal arrests, and in a population size of 330 million, that's pretty good, right? Or the other story could be, there used to be 20 arrests, and now there's 98. What is happening, right? And so that is where I like the delta. What is the difference between what we think is going to happen and what actually is happening?
How This is an impossible question for any single person to answer, but you have obviously thought a lot about this. I'm wondering how America sort of like comes together after what has been like a particularly tense period for us. I mean, you're talking about the trend line going up, up, up. As we said, like this was a difficult election. I mean, what kinds of things can be done to kind of take the temperature down, as I've already said, but just like, it's not just stopping people from doing this, it's stopping them from wanting to. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I had that answer. I could retire rich, but a few things to think about, right? It is incumbent on our public officials to lower the temperature down, meaning that to when these type of arrests happen, to make an announcement saying that's not okay, and you don't represent my values or the things I believe in on that. And so that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is, the social media algorithms basically feed us into an echo chamber where we're going to get constantly more and more mad. And so to the extent we can kind of unplug or provide some level of kind of understanding of how kind of the radicalization process or even the echo chamber works in general, I think would be helpful on this. There's also something to be said about prosecutions as deterrents, meaning that if you look at the cases in the last 12 plus years, a good number of those individuals got interviewed by the FBI and said, oh, I thought that was okay. Meaning that, oh, I thought I could threaten to kill my local congressman because that's protected speech, not understanding that they crossed a legal threshold. And so to the extent we make these kind of prosecutions more public, it may tamp down on second and third order effects of it.
I'm interested in the second point that you made about social media, because as somebody who is social media famous, as you are, how do you how do you sort of curate your own feed or sort of keep yourself out of the echo chamber?
Yeah. So I'm not TikTok famous yet. That's my next goal in life.
X famous.
Yeah. So for me, I generally like, the reason I got into federal court records is because it was mental floss. Meaning that, you and I and the rest of us at NCITE, we look at the worst that society has to offer, right? The neo-Nazis, the ISIS, the Hamas, the anti-Semites, you name it, every single day. And so to be able to dive into federal court records and kind of clean my mind of whatever horrible thing I just had to research is helpful for me. I like to curate a feed that is everything and not just one thing, meaning that I will follow extreme right-wing folks, I will follow extreme left-wing folks, and then I will try to take as much information from all sides and try to see it from their perspective as best as humanly possible. Understanding you have your own lodestar that kind of guides you in these type of things and grounds you on your kind of your moral compass on this. But for me, it's not necessarily kind of block my way out of it. It is really just take it all in and then make my own decision on that. Now that becomes a lot harder when the systems and institutions of which we used to kind of base our understanding and trust on are increasingly not seen as institutions of trust by the public at large. And so I think it's incumbent on, say, like place like NCITE to be that nonpartisan location that's just the facts, ma'am type of approach, because there's so many other people that are trying to work a buck or grift their way through these type of things, or trying to get people as agitated and as upset as humanly possible. Right. So I'm not interested in following every troll that has it. Sometimes I'll smirk at what they say, but then I'll move on and realize that they're not real life. And then every once in a while, it's important just to go touch grass. Right. So you'll be amazed with the anger that you see on an X or a Facebook. And then you go to your kid's baseball game and you can have a normal conversation about the election with somebody else next to you because he's coaching your kid's baseball game. Right. And you see that person, as opposed to a opponent or a villain or something else in there. So we have to kind of remember that, you can tweet your anger out to the world, but at the end of the day, you still got to live in the world, and you have to kind of be part of a society that is grown and built in an America that's built on these kind of relationships and this idea of a kind of greater good.
Yeah, the internet is not real life. That's very good. Very good advice. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Seamus. Do you have anything else you want to share with anybody before we go?
No, listen, we're going to keep tracking this. So, Pete and I have been looking at this pretty significantly. I'm really interested in what the next 6 months looks like for threats against public officials. If it drops dramatically, that's a interesting sign. If it continues on, that's an interesting sign too. And so we'll keep diving in and seeing the cases as they come in, and we'll call a spade and a ball a strike and a strike. And so we'll figure that all out. But I'm really, really interested in what happens the next 6 months.
All right. Well, yeah, I look forward to seeing what you find out and sharing it with everybody. So, well, all right. Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Seamus, again. And we will catch you later.
Thank you.
This series is produced by Ben Batafarano, Aaron Grace, Scott Jordan, and Blake Ursch. Thank you for joining us on another episode of NCITE Insights. NCITE is an academic center of excellence for the Department of Homeland Security. Looking for more info? Check out our website at incite.unomaha.edu or email us at incite@unomaha.edu.